The floor of the induction hall shook, and every alien officer in the room turned toward the sound before they turned toward me. An alarm cut through the station, sharp and metallic, and for one long second nobody moved. Then the doors at the far end sealed themselves with a hiss, and a voice from the ceiling announced a hull breach on the lower deck, level 3, containment failing. I was standing in a line of new recruits when it happened, waiting to have my file checked, and within a heartbeat that quiet formal room turned into chaos. Officers shouted orders in 3 different languages at once. A tall alien beside me, plated in deep blue armor across his shoulders, froze completely, staring at the flashing red light above the exit as if it might attack him personally. Nobody had trained for this, not today, not during intake. I moved before I decided to move. That is the strange thing about training that actually sticks with you. Your body remembers before your mind catches up. I grabbed the nearest emergency panel, found the manual override lever behind a plastic guard, and pulled it down hard enough to hurt my palm. The doors on level 3 locked shut half a second before the pressure alarm would have opened them the wrong way, and pulled half the corridor into open space. The room went silent again, but differently this time. The alarm kept flashing, quieter now, and a station technician's voice confirmed over the speaker that the breach was contained and casualties were 0. I let go of the lever and turned around, and every single officer in that hall was staring at me. A tall commander with pale gray skin and sharp, narrow eyes stepped forward first. Her name tag read Commander Voss, and her uniform carried more decoration than anyone else's in the room. She looked at the panel, then at me, and something like suspicion crossed her face. "How did you know which lever to pull?" she said. Not a question, really. More like an accusation dressed up as one. "Training," I said. "Emergency systems are mostly the same shape no matter who builds them. Pressure locks first." She studied me for another second, unconvinced, then turned back toward the front of the hall as if the moment had never happened. The alarm shut off completely a minute later, and the room slowly returned to its business, but the officers kept glancing at me while pretending not to. That was the first time I noticed the way they looked at me, not with respect, with doubt. My name is Daniel Harlow, and 3 years ago I would never have imagined standing on a space station orbiting a planet I could not even pronounce, waiting to be judged by beings who had never met a human before. Earth had joined a wider community of worlds not long before that, something the news back home called the greatest moment in human history. Out here, among people who had been traveling between stars for centuries, it felt like being the newest kid in a school that had already picked its favorites. The recruit line moved forward again, and eventually it was my turn at the intake desk. A broad-shouldered instructor with rough green skin and short tusks studied a tablet without looking up. His nameplate read Pierce, though I doubted that was his real name. Most alien officers picked something simple for humans to pronounce. "Harlow Daniel," he read aloud. "Human, 29 years old. Transferred from something called Special Warfare Training." He glanced up with an expression that was almost amused. "Curious. Your species has had contact with the wider galaxy for what, 3 years, and already you send us soldiers." A few officers nearby laughed quietly. "We had wars long before we had spaceships," I said. That earned another round of laughter, sharper this time, less friendly. "No offense meant," Pierce said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It is simply strange to see someone so soft assigned to combat training. No implants, no enhanced bones, no neural boosters." He tapped his own temple, where a faint metallic line ran beneath the skin. Just flesh and nerve endings, fragile. I kept my expression calm. I had heard worse growing up, from people who looked exactly like me and still found reasons to underestimate a person. "Let's see the rest of your file," Pierce continued, scrolling through the tablet. Then he stopped scrolling. His brow, or whatever passed for one on his species, drew together. "There is a gap here," he said. 6 months. Sealed. "Classified," I said, above my authority to explain without proper clearance. That got the loudest laugh yet. Even Commander Voss, standing a few feet away, allowed herself a thin smile. "Above your own authority," Pierce repeated, almost delighted by the phrase. "The humans redact information from their own soldiers now. Remarkable." I said nothing. Explaining myself to people who had already decided what I was would not help. I had learned that lesson a long time ago, back on Earth, long before any of this. Pierce shrugged and tapped the tablet to project my file onto the large screen above the intake desk, meant to show the assembled instructors a quick overview of the newest batch of recruits. Most of my record displayed normally. Physical scores, aptitude results, basic service history. Then the display reached the sealed section, and instead of simply graying out, The screen flashed amber and locked entirely. A new message appeared across it in bold, glowing letters. Restricted access. Council-level clearance required. Requesting authorization from issuing authority. The laughter in the room stopped completely. "That is not a standard human security marking," said a new voice from the back of the hall. Every officer straightened at once. A tall figure walked forward, dressed in a uniform far more decorated than Commander Voss's. Silver markings across the shoulders that clearly meant something important. His nameplate read Admiral Bolton, and I recognized the title even if I had never seen the man himself. He was the senior liaison for the entire training station, the highest-ranking officer most recruits would ever speak to directly. "That marking belongs to the wider council," Admiral Bolton said, studying the frozen screen. "Not to Earth's own military. Someone with far greater authority sealed this file, not your government alone." He turned to me directly. "Recruit, who authorized this record?" I straightened my posture the way I had been trained to, years ago, on a different planet entirely. "Fleet Admiral Grace Whitmore, sir, from Earth's Joint Command, and co-signed by our council liaison at the time. I was assigned to a joint operation. I am not trying to be difficult. I genuinely cannot discuss the details without proper clearance." Admiral Bolton studied me for a long moment, then walked to the desk himself and entered a code into the terminal. The screen flared brighter, processed for a few seconds, then unlocked completely. I did not need to read it. I already knew every word, because I had lived through every second of it. Instead, I watched the faces of the officers around me as they read it for the first time. 6 months earlier, I had been part of a small joint team sent to investigate a research outpost that had gone silent on a fractured moon called Perrin's Reach. The area sat inside contested territory, close to the border patrolled by a hostile group known across this region simply as the Skarn, a faction with a long history of attacking outposts and taking whoever they found. Nobody who encountered them expected mercy, and few who vanished into their territory were ever seen again. Our team had 9 members, 2 humans, 3 from a species with plated shoulders similar to the officer standing frozen near the doorway earlier, 2 smaller beings with rapid speech patterns, 1 heavily built demolition specialist, and a navigator from a species with pale, almost translucent skin. The file explained what happened without dressing it up. Our transport was damaged during approach. 7 of the 9 team members did not survive the first several minutes on the ground. The 2 who remained, myself and a navigator named Ilsa Wren, found themselves cut off from any rescue, with 11 surviving research staff depending entirely on them, 40 kilometers from the nearest safe extraction point, across land controlled entirely by the Skarn. The record continued. Over 4 days, all 13 survivors made it out alive. The report credited the surviving human recruit with organizing the escape route, disabling several patrol units using improvised equipment recovered from the outpost, and carrying an injured researcher on his back for the final 11 kilometers after she broke her leg crossing rocky terrain. It also explained why the record had been sealed in the first place. Perrin's Reach sat inside disputed territory that 3 different governments were quietly trying not to argue about in public. Full disclosure of what happened there risked reopening a diplomatic argument nobody wanted, so the details were locked away, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but to keep an uneasy peace intact. The hall stayed silent for a long moment after the file finished loading. Pierce, the instructor who had joked about fragile bones only minutes earlier, stared at the screen without speaking. His earlier smile had completely disappeared. "No implants," he said quietly, almost to himself. "No enhancements. Just training. Just training," I agreed. And I did not do it alone. Ilsa did not make it home. Neither did 5 others. I think about that far more than I think about the part where I survived. Admiral Bolton looked at me the way someone looks at a person they have suddenly understood in a completely different light. "Commander Voss," he said, turning toward her. "Strike the earlier assessment from today's evaluation record." "Yes, Admiral," she said, and when she looked at me again, the doubt from earlier had been replaced by something closer to respect, the kind that only comes when someone has been proven wrong and is honest enough to admit it. I saluted the way I had been taught back home, the only way I knew how, and nobody in the hall laughed this time. Later that evening, after the intake session finally ended, I found a quiet corner of the station's dining hall and sat alone with a tray of food I did not fully recognize. The station cafeteria offered meals designed for a dozen different species, and half of what looked appetizing to me apparently smelled terrible to everyone else, and the reverse was just as true. Pierce found me there and sat down across from me without asking, which I had already learned was about as close to an apology as his species tended to offer. "You should have said something earlier," he said. when I made that comment about fragile bones. Would it have changed anything? I asked. He considered the question honestly instead of brushing it aside. Probably not, he admitted. We hear stories about your species secondhand, mostly through old records and rumors. It does not prepare you for the parts nobody talks about. That is probably true of most species, I said. You never really know what someone is carrying until circumstances force you to look. He nodded slowly, and something in his expression shifted into quiet respect. For what it is worth, he said, standing to leave, I am glad someone like you is carrying it. I watched him walk away, and thought about Ilsa, and the 5 others who never made it home, and the 11 kilometers I carried an injured woman across broken ground, with nothing but willpower keeping my legs moving. It was not the kind of welcome I had expected when I first stepped onto this station that morning, but it felt honest, and that mattered more to me than approval ever could. The next few weeks of training passed differently than I expected. Word about the sealed file had spread quickly, the way news always does in any tightly packed group of people, whether human or otherwise. Officers who had barely acknowledged me during the first week suddenly wanted my opinion during tactical exercises. Recruits from other species asked questions about human training methods with genuine curiosity instead of polite dismissal. Commander Voss, in particular, changed the most. She began pulling me aside after sessions to ask pointed questions about how humans approached problem-solving under pressure. Questions that had nothing to do with weapons or tactics and everything to do with decision-making when resources ran short and time ran shorter. Your species is young, she told me one evening, standing beside a viewing window overlooking the planet below. Younger than almost anyone else in this alliance. And yet you already understand something many older species forget. What is that? I asked. That survival is rarely about strength alone, she said. It is about refusing to stop thinking clearly when everything around you falls apart. I thought about that conversation often in the months that followed, especially during the harder parts of training, when exhaustion made every decision feel impossible, and every instructor seemed determined to push us past whatever limits we thought we had. Training on the station was unlike anything I experienced back on Earth. Gravity simulators adjusted daily to prepare recruits for a dozen different planetary environments. Language modules ran constantly in the background of every conversation, translating between species in real time, though I still preferred learning basic phrases myself whenever I could. Station. Tactical simulations grew more complex each week, testing coordination between species who had never worked together before joining the same unit. Through it all, one thing remained constant. Whenever a crisis arose during a simulation, whenever pressure built and choices needed to be made quickly, people started looking toward me first, the way they had after that very first alarm in the induction hall. It surprised me at first, then it simply became normal. Near the end of the training cycle, our unit faced a final evaluation exercise designed to test everything we had learned across months of preparation. The scenario placed us on a simulated outpost experiencing multiple system failures at once, forcing the entire team to coordinate rescue efforts, manage limited resources, and make quick decisions with incomplete information. Pierce oversaw the exercise personally, watching from a control room above the simulation floor. Admiral Bolton observed as well, along with several other senior officers curious to see how the newest group of recruits would handle sustained pressure. The simulation began exactly the way real emergencies always seem to begin, quietly, before escalating faster than anyone expects. A reactor warning appeared on one console, then a second warning appeared on another system entirely. Within minutes, half the simulated outpost reported some kind of failure, and the team needed to prioritize which problems demanded immediate attention and which could wait. I found myself coordinating almost without thinking about it, drawing on instincts built over years of training that started long before I ever left Earth. Commander Voss, participating alongside us rather than simply observing, followed my lead without hesitation, trusting decisions she would have questioned only months earlier. The exercise lasted just under 3 hours, and by the end, every simulated system had been stabilized, every simulated casualty avoided. When the lights came back up and the simulation ended, the room stayed quiet for a moment, before Admiral Bolton spoke from the observation deck above. "Well done," he said simply, and the words carried more weight coming from him than any lengthy speech could have managed. Afterward, standing outside the simulation chamber while the rest of the team dispersed toward the dining hall, Commander Voss approached me one final time before the evaluation results were officially recorded. "When you first arrived," she said, "I doubted you. I will admit that honestly, because pretending otherwise would insult everything you have shown since." "I understand," I said. "You had no reason to expect anything different. Most of what your people know about mine came from old records, nothing recent, nothing personal. That is changing, she said, because of people like you. I thought about Ilsa Wren again in that moment, and the 5 other members of our original team who never made it home from Perrin's Reach, and felt the familiar weight of carrying their memory forward into everything I did afterward. It was not a burden I resented. If anything, it reminded me why every decision mattered, why every second of hesitation carried real consequences, and why the training I had once treated as routine had become something closer to a promise I intended to keep for the rest of my life. Standing there on a station orbiting a planet I still could not pronounce correctly, surrounded by officers from species I had never even heard of a few years earlier, I realized something that felt strangely simple after everything that happened. Respect was never something anyone owed me automatically, and it never would be. It had to be earned, one decision at a time, one honest moment at a time, regardless of where a person came from or what they looked like walking through the door. I had earned mine the hard way, and I intended to keep earning it, one day, one mission, one honest choice at a time, for as long as I wore this uniform. Commander Voss extended her hand toward me, an earth gesture she had clearly learned specifically for this moment, and I shook it firmly, grateful, finally, to simply belong somewhere among the stars.